This is House Planning Help episode 97. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you want a high-performance, comfortable home. I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century. My personal goal is to create an energy-efficient home before I turn 40 in August 2016. Coming up in this session, my guest is Peter Warm from Warm Low Energy Building Practice, and we're asking, what do you get for Passivhaus certification? Is it just that piece of paper, or perhaps a little bit more? If you're a first-time listener, you join me at an interesting moment because we are now 3 years into this blog, to my research, and as you probably just heard, my challenge of transitioning into an energy-efficient home before I turn 40. I'm now 39, I've got 1 year left, and my progress so far, I'll give you the full update, being frank and everything, after we've heard today's interview. It's another good one too. Peter Warm is someone I've tried to get on the podcast for a while. He's a busy man. Our schedules haven't exactly aligned until now, which is good because he's got decades of experience when it comes to low energy buildings. He's built 5 of his own, obviously a number with his building practice and his career. And he's one of only a handful of UK Passivhaus certifiers. So he seemed the perfect person to ask about Passivhaus certification. What's going to increase the likelihood of you reaching the standard? What are the common pitfalls? And when you've done all of this, what are you actually getting for this all? First, though, I asked him about his career and interest in sustainable building.
I've worked as an energy engineer all my life because I'm just fascinated by that idea of you can build a building, you stick it down anywhere you like, and it becomes warm inside, without any heating. I just love that. And I spend a lot of time looking at passive solar. It's all about insulation and airtightness and understanding it. And then Passivhaus came along. It's fantastic. Here we were struggling to meet a standard in the UK with the ACB. And then we suddenly find someone's already done it 20 years ago. So yes, we just adopted it. We overcome the not invented here bit and actually got there and said, yes, we're going to do Passivhaus. And the first thing we learned about Passivhaus was once you get the insulation and the airtightness right, you don't want all that glazing. You really don't, because the early MIT Learngy houses, 100% glazing on the south face. If you do that with the Passivhaus, you have got a solar cooker. Okay, and trying to communicate that to architects is one of our biggest struggles, to say, do you realise that you think you're designing a Learngy building? We're telling you you've got an oven.
You can have glazing, but is it being careful that that glazing is shaded, or what do you mean exactly?
Absolutely. You can put in a large amount of glazing, but then you have to put in a large amount of shading. Okay, and certainly simple summer shading on the south facade, shelves projecting out above the window. That's the simplest way of doing it, but it all costs money. So you're paying for a lot of glass, and then you've got to pay for the shading. So you can understand when we're talking to housing associations, the most important thing is that we don't want the grand designs. It's a problem. It's actually, you're making a problem you've then got to spend more money to get rid of as well.
How do you get that balance then with the glazing in terms of, because people like the grand designs or the views?
I know. And probably those are the people who can afford the electricity bills for the cooling units. Now, for normal houses, 25%, 35% of the south-facing glazing, maybe much less for the north, a little bit on the east and west. It's like normal rules. We don't actually want... Glass boxes are a huge problem. They're a huge problem. Aesthetically and architecturally, they may present that kind of wonderful open vista, but the truth is that they are effectively huge energy consumers, either for heating or cooling.
I wanted to talk to you a little bit about certification today, Passivhaus certification, that is, because that's a lot of what you do. And so can I start at how you got involved with this process? You've told me about your career and moving forwards and finding out about Passivhaus, but how did it go on from there?
Well, I think the AECB adopting the Passivhaus as its own energy standard, as the basis for its own energy standard, was the key. And then somebody had to volunteer to go to Germany to find out how to do it. And I got volunteered. And that's basically how I started doing certifications. I kind of got dropped in it, if you like. But it's a wonderful thing, certification, because people see it as, it's a bit like an exam. I see it as it's like training. If we are certifying a building, we don't like people, when it's finished, people just giving us the details and we tick it. We see it as it's an on-the-site training. So what we're actually doing is we want an initial check before we put it into planning, because we want to make sure we haven't got too much glass, that the mass is appropriate. We can tell people how much insulation, what U values they sort of typically need at that stage. And then before they go on site, we want the whole thing worked out. We want all the designs worked out so we can look at it and say, there's a thermal bridge. Can you design that out? Here's a projection. Are you really sure you want that because of what it does to the heat loss? So in a way, it's a training for designers to actually make their buildings much, much more efficient in terms of the insulation and airtightness.
Should we always be getting certification? Is there a reason why? Because it does cost, doesn't it, to have a certified building? Or as you say, is it really just that training the first few times until you get it?
Well, I struggle really because I know that quite a lot of people think they can do Passive House without certification. And the problem with that is that, in a sense, is we don't have a common basis. If it's not certified, we can't say, well, somebody who's trained by the Institute has actually said, yes, this house meets the design of this house meets the certification criteria. So that's the biggest thing, really, is that if you don't get it certified, it's a problem. I'm much happier with people who we've worked with, we've done 10, 15 buildings and certified them. And if they want to go off and do buildings and not get them certified, that's great. In any case, we give them a very, very low quote because they know it. So we know that our time is really about the documentation. It's about actually getting the certificate out. We know they're not going to mess it up because they've done it with us. We've worked with them. So I don't have any problem about not certifying buildings once you've got onto that plateau of having it done. I do have a problem with people claiming Passive House when they haven't had it checked. They might be right, but the chances are, our experience is generally we find people do come away with quite a lot. They learn a lot in the process.
Because of the rigor that goes into it, can you foresee a time when actually there's value in having achieved the Passive House standard and having all the certification documents?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think I'd have to think about that one. That's a very complicated question because I think...
Why?
Well, I tell you, there's two things going on, right? The first is that, what I'm clear about, we talk about Passive House certification. As far as I'm concerned, it's just about building buildings sensibly, doing it properly. Yeah? In 20 years' time, we will be doing what we call Passive House now. Whatever we call it then, I don't know. It's just that quality of build. We do have a problem in the UK in that, sometimes I think it's a historical problem in that we own very high levels of ownership. I think it's over 60% of our property is owned by people. And often, to be perfectly frank, when you compare it with certainly Germany, the quality of the build and the fittings is very, very low. And it's a bit like, we couldn't quite afford to patch the roof, to put a new roof on, so we patched it this time. There's that sense. So when you bring insulation into it, the big problem with insulation is it creates temperature difference, and temperature difference is a moisture problem, condensation issue. So there is a risk in not doing it properly. So on the one hand, I can see, yes, okay, we won't need Passive House in the future. On the other hand, we will need to be very careful about people doing retrofit insulation, but doing it in a way that actually produces mold or condensation and eventual rot and health damage. I think that is an issue, and it may be something that grows out of the Passive House. It may not be. I think we'll need a whole lot of education, which I know the AECB and the Carbon Light Retrofit is starting to address that, just to let people know the dangers of getting it wrong, right? If you put the insulation in the wrong place, you could have a problem, okay? A huge amount of education needs to go on about that. But having done that, will we need certification? Well, I think I can see value as a house buyer. I'm a little cynical about a lot of the surveys which go on, but I think I would like to see we would see a house buyers or a surveyor's reporting have people who are knowledgeable about the insulation placement and be able to say, yes, this is okay. This is external insulation. This is fine. This is internal insulation. Potentially this is dangerous. We think this should be opened up and examined. So in the future, yes, we're going to take this kind of passive house stuff and we're going to spread it into the normal processes that we go through buying a house or building a house now.
It's interesting you say that, because I see this as the biggest issue that we have, that the new build stuff is the easy bit.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's the retrofit that's really hard.
Absolutely.
So why are we still building the new stuff as poor quality and on quite a big scale?
Well, I think, as a engineer, you look at it and you think, why don't we do this? And I think a lot of it is not invented here. And I have to say, I'm afraid, as far as I'm concerned, I think the House Builders Federation has a lot to answer for it. A very, very strong lobbying organisation. I read only a month ago they were claiming that there was no need to improve the standards, that the low energy standards and the builder regulations were perfectly satisfactory. Where, what I hear is, they're not even meeting those standards, the performance as measured. They don't measure stuff. And they don't even do every building. They manage to weasel out of doing airtightness tests on every building, which is for Passive House. We do every building. We have to do that because you don't pick up the mistakes. And the other thing is that this idea that they think the current standards are good enough, you just think they're obviously just not interested. They're just interested in shifting buildings and making life easy for themselves and not having to learn about this new stuff. And they're going to be, they're certainly not going to be in the vanguard of the movement.
We could get ourselves stuck in a rut here, I know.
We could, very easily.
Let's go back to certification.
Certification.
Certification. For someone who thinks they want a passive house and they're coming in, do they need to think much about certification, or is it more for them hiring the right architect and builder? How much will they deal with certification, or is it more on a professional basis?
The best advice I would give to someone who wants a passive house built or a retrofit is actually to go to someone who's already demonstrated that they've got the experience. Yeah. That person will almost certainly have already done some certifications or have done some training. There'll be some indication that that architect or designer or builder has somehow pinned his colours to the wall by investing in himself in training or certification of some form. If you want to work with a particular designer who hasn't done that, then you need certification even more. Because effectively what you're doing is you are in fact actually paying, because we always like the client to pay for the certification. You are in fact paying for your favourite architect to get trained. Okay, as long as you're aware of that, and you may find that perfectly acceptable because there's something about the design, something about the lines he draws and the buildings he's done that you love. That's fine, but you need to be clear that it's unlikely for an architect who hasn't had the training to be able to understand the issues of his design without some substantial support. And effectively, that's what certification can provide.
Take me through what you might do with one client who's going for certification. When do you interact with them, and what is your role? Well,
first of all, I'll say initially, we tend to interact most with the designer, the architect, yeah. That's our preferred role because, as I said, it's about training and teaching. So I'm going to talk about it in those terms, if that's okay. First, somebody usually rings us up with an inquiry and said, I've got this design, I want to make Passive House, or the client wants to make Passive House. We say straight away, send us in some plans, some sketches. We'll give you a quote for the certification process. And that quote is, when we look at it, we have a system of coming up with how long it's going to take. And the Institute wants us not to make a huge profit out of certification. They want the cost to be low, but we have to be very careful because we have to look at it and say, well, how many hours is it going to take? The most crucial thing is the experience of the designer. So frankly, the range of costs is probably 4-to-1 between somebody who we've worked with many, many times before, and it's so simple, and someone we haven't worked with first time at all. And we think, whoa, we're not sure how much you know at all. So that in that initial quote, if you're working with somebody who hasn't done it before, that's going to be quite high for a single house. Could be well over £2,000. plus the VAT, of course. And then, of course, if you're dealing with somebody who's so experienced, we're almost down to the paperwork costs and the cost of the plaque to screw to it. It could be under £1,000, way under £1,000. So there's a huge range. That's the first thing. So we put the quote out. Then the next thing we say is in the quote, we want to look at the design before planning. Very crucial. Because of the window size, the fenestration, the solar gain, basically, and the shape of the building, its form factor, which means how much insulation you need in it. To get those two things right before planning, then usually there's a sort of a long period where we hear nothing, and then the design is produced, and often we get the whole package of all the details, the week before you're going to start on site, which we're not too keen on. We like a few weeks. Give us 3 or 4 weeks, please. We look at it, we analyse it, we build our own PHPP, or we usually build our own PHPP to check that actually all the details are right, that we're happy the thermal bridging is okay, the air tightness looks like it's going to work, the heating system, the ventilation has been designed and there's space for it. So then we actually put a full check through and we issue a little report saying, yeah, it's fine. And we suggest often that people aim a little bit below the 15, maybe sort of 13 and a half, 14. Give us a bit of margin, because our experience is when we get on site, structural engineer comes along and says, we need some steel here to hold that bit up. I didn't realise we needed that, etc. There's a little bit of things that happen. And so, anyway, the build continues. In small projects, we don't generally need to be involved in that at all. In large projects, we are involved, because large projects, the issue is that the tradesmen on site, there's a lot of churn, a lot of subcontractors come and go. And although some of the larger contractors do have a mechanism for training people in basic passive house, we need to go and check that somebody hasn't done something really stupid. Because if you can pick that up early, you can get it fixed for cheap. If you leave it till the end, you've got a real problem, really expensive to fix at that point. So we get to the end, and at the end is the all-important final air test. We do the air test, and we have a look at the commissioning report for the MVHR, something we're very, very hot on, making sure that the MVHR, the ventilation system, is working properly and quietly. It's not noisy. And then if we're happy with the whole package, we send it off to Germany. They give us a random check and they send it back with a number. We issue a certificate. Hey, you've done it. Well done.
Why would a building not get certification?
Usual reason is failing the airtightness.
But if you've gone through all that bit beforehand, you would hope that it's going to make it. So what goes wrong in between?
People don't listen. It's usually the problem.
Right, good one.
We say, look, here's your airtightness line. How are you going to be able to test that before you cover it up with plasterboard? Yeah, and if they don't do that and they cover it up with plasterboard, then when it fails, they have a choice. They either take all the plasterboard off, which means literally gut the house to fix the airtightness, or they don't get the certification. And usually they don't get the certification. This is not that common, but it is, on the one-off houses, that's the big issue, is the airtightness and understanding that. Being able to test it at an early enough stage, which often means putting the windows and doors in earlier than you would normally. A lot of builders like to keep the windows and doors out in case they get damaged, on site. Understand that last moment. But we need them in, because it's the only way you get a realistic air test is to do that fairly early on. To do it while you still access the air tightness layer, whatever it is, whether it's OSB or membrane or plaster or et cetera, et cetera. For larger buildings, we're finding that it's not so much the air tightness, it's actually the building services that seem to be the problem. And in particularly, poorly designed ventilation units, or poorly installed, with using flexible ducting hasn't been cut to size properly, so it's all wrapped around itself and provides a restriction. That means the fan's working harder, which means noise. My concern is very simple, is that I want to go into the bedrooms and not hear the MVHR when it's on its normal setting. If I can hear it, and my hearing isn't that good, I'm 62 now, I know my hearing's fading. If I can hear it, I think it's unacceptable. Because very simply, people are not used to having ventilation running continuously in the background. And the last thing we want is them to be annoyed by the noise and go and turn it off. That's a disaster. So that second point is making sure that the ventilation system has been put in. That's the second reason that people fail the passive house.
Any others that you can think of off the top of your head? Or?
Not really. Once you start down the process, I mean, the only other reason that people fail is because they haven't taken part in the whole process. They've built the thing and then asked us to certify it afterwards. Well, they may or may not make it.
In this certification process, is there anything else that we need to think about? It sounds very simple, the way that you've described it. Yes?
Yeah, I'd say it's pretty simple, but it is an extra step. And, to be fair, we're not very good in the UK about admitting that we don't know how to do things. So it's a little difficult for the architect who hasn't done this process to accept that he's learning. I mean, that's almost the most important thing, is to say, for people who don't have a problem with that, it's easy. People who think they have to know it all, it is a bit of a problem.
For people that miss certification, some of these that you've mentioned, is there a consequence to it normally or not really? It's just you haven't got a certified building. Well,
I think, are you saying is there a value in having a certified building? Well, I mean, the real value is knowing that you're going to achieve the comfort standard and it's going to be a nice place to live in. If you fail on airtightness, well, you may find they've got some drafts. You may find that it's not quite as comfortable as you like. If you fail on the noise from the MVHR, well, who wants to live in a house that's noisy? I mean, it's about, ultimately, the Passivhaus standard is based on comfort for the people inside. And comfort's one of those strange things where if you notice it, it's not comfortable. It's the absence of annoyance, if you like. Comforts are both thermally and noise and any other sort of comfort.
Well, let's talk about where we're recording this interview now, because we're in your Enefit office.
Yeah.
Very nice it is too, but has that whole process of doing this retrofit taught you anything? Because it's quite often you can be looking at other people's buildings, but to have done it yourself.
Oh yes, I think how can you offer advice without practical experience? I don't think you can, and I think that's the task, really, isn't it? Maybe we need to get all the architects to do their own houses first. That would solve the problem.
Well, it's funny because you would often think that as an outsider coming in, that every architect's going to have this fantastic studio and fantastic house, but no, not often.
Maybe we need to pay them a bit more.
Maybe. So, what were the challenges of this office here? Because I imagine people might face similar retrofits. We'll show a picture in the show notes.
Yeah. The main issues here were airtightness. That was a big issue for us. And knowing when we first put the fan in the door, because it was a flat before we turned it into an office, and the tenants were complaining about how cold it was, especially when the wind blew, very drafty. So when we put the fan in the door and turned it up, this is a big sized door fan, air test fan pressurization fan. We turned it up. We couldn't even meet 50 pascals because it was so leaky. It just 1960s construction, and that just wasn't in their book. Didn't know about airtightness at all. And that's probably the most significant thing is, I mean, before we turned it into an office, we were going to do something about the airtightness anyway. We knew it was an issue from the feedback from the tenants. But turning it into an office, perfect opportunity for us to live in it.
And how did you do that? Because it's an existing building, so did you strip it right back, or I know you insulated externally?
Yes, well, we spent a lot of time thinking about the various options, and in the end we chose the airtightness to be on the outside of the building. So cavity wall building, 60s. So we filled the cavity as well, mostly for draft proofing, but the airtightness on the outside, on the inside of the external insulation. Okay, so that was the layer. Then deciding where the airtightness line was on the roof was very important. We chose to put it up and over the existing roof, take all the tiles off, put an airtightness membrane and layer in there, and then build insulation on the outside of that. And probably the biggest challenge was airtightness, was the leakage to the shop below. And we spent a lot of time on making sure that was completely airtight. And in the end, around the stairs was almost like we got to the point of saying, we're going to have to take the stairs out. And we said, no, we're going to do a co-pressurization test. So we pressurized the shop and this building, and what the indication we got was the leaks were to the shop, not to outside, and that's acceptable.
And using this building every day, you're happy? No overheating, no issues or anything like that?
No, we've monitored it for temperature over the last year. We do get some peaks. We've got quite small south-facing glazing, thank God. We do have shades over them, but they are manual. So we have to decide to put them down over the week. Is it going to be a hot weekend? Yeah, we have to. So there's a kind of it's not automatic. So we have to learn to use it.
For retrofits, and particularly for smaller buildings, is it really beneficial not to have virtually any glazing on the south side? Because the body heat, you've got an office here, so you've got a number of people in it. I mean, it feels very
office
comfortable now.
Machinery as well. We have
machinery, yes, of course.
We spend a lot of time looking at our IT. And it is very important to look at the equipment you've got in the house, because it is going to be a problem in summer. We're looking to the future. The point about Passivhaus, in my view, is it's the end point. Having worked for years, where every 5 years building regulations change and more insulation. The beauty about the Passivhaus is clearly where we're going. You're not going to have to do that again. Your projects are not going to be out of date. However, it does kind of imply that we're going to be using futuristic internal equipment, energy consuming equipment, particularly electrical. And what's very clear is that a lot of people are using equipment which is very old photocopiers, old PCs particularly, very, very inefficient, give a lot of heat. Plasma TVs, all these sort of things, they're not efficient. They won't be around in 20 years. They're absolutely clear about that. So, you have to be very careful, particularly in residential, it's kind of okay. But in the office environment and the school environment, we have to be very careful about the amount of kit that's actually put in and the heat that it'll give off in summer. So as part of the non-residential certification process, we actually make sure that there's a whole analysis of the electrical kit which will go in, and the hot water system as well. I should mention that as well. We have, in fact, failed a Passivhaus, even though it did everything right apart from the hot water. And the hot water, what it did is it had bathrooms in every corner, and they were fed by the traditional large diameter pipes, 22, 28 mil hot water pipes running around the house. And the heat loss from that was enough to blow the primary energy target out of the water. Very unusual. Nowadays, we would all use microbore hot water piping from a manifold. We wouldn't use the old-fashioned way, simply because of the amount of heat gains you get from it, which we really have to be very careful of in the Passivhaus.
Well, we're just about at the end now. So is there any final thoughts? I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be on certification, but that's been the bulk of the interview.
I think just the thing I would say to people who are considering doing this is that just to be aware that you are going to get a fantastic house, a fantastic place to live. Okay. That's what the standard is about. What you're also doing is you're taking part in the process about us trying to wean ourselves off fossil fuel. This is going to be, you're at the sharp end of the wedge. You're doing this, you're going to be investing money in this, you'll get the comfort, you're also helping this whole process, because it is inevitable. It is such common sense. It will happen. You're just making it happen a little earlier.
Peter, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we've been taking the notes at this end, so you don't have to. They're online, houseplanninghelp.com/97. There's a summary of our conversation, also links to Peter and warm, low energy building practice. And I've embedded a video. We talked about the retrofitted office, so you can take a look at their office. They got it up to Enefit standard. Just get an overview of that in 2 minutes. houseplanninghelp.com/97. At the beginning of this episode, I mentioned that I'd celebrate another birthday. I've turned 39 now, and so I've been working for 3 years on House Planning Help, also in the background thinking about the house that I'd like to transition into, whether it be a new build or a retrofit. And at the beginning of this year, I got serious, because normally I would have maybe 8 or 9 goals that I'd like to achieve in a year. I thought, this year, I'm only going to have 2, because I really need to do this. One of those was to find land by August. Yeah, that didn't happen, did it? And the second one was to launch the hub at some point throughout the year. We've got a launch date for that this coming month, in fact. Very exciting. I'll tell you more in subsequent episodes, but it's going to coincide with episode 100. We're going to launch the hub. At the beginning of the podcast, I say about my personal goal is to create an energy efficient home before I turn 40 in August 2016. And every time I say that, in my mind, perhaps there's a little voice saying, oh, you really should stop saying that. I wouldn't do, because you're never going to make it now. You've only got a year. And so I am feeling the pressure. I don't mind failing and not hitting that target if I've gone all out to do this, but I do find it very frustrating. And there are other pressures in my life that the current house that I'm in is too small, and I'm trying to use that pressure to force me somehow to get this. I know that we're not fully flexible because we do want to stay in a fairly small geographic area, which I know is limiting the choices that we have. We probably looked at about 10 to 15 different houses, plots, mixture of different things. We put in one offer so far, which we lost out on, and I wish we'd fought harder because I know that we could have got that now, but it came fairly early on in the process and it looked like a plot. And I think that's part of the issue, that when something looks like a plot, then guess what? You've got lots of competition. Everyone or similar people are trying to get hold of it. So just analysing what I've been doing and where I'm at, there's another thing that is annoying me, and I think it's this barrier of sinking so much money into a house. When I think of the house that I've got at the moment, which isn't a very expensive house, and then I think of how much I'm going to have to spend to get, well, even just the plot of land to begin with. That's annoying me. That means that I'm going to have to sell a lot of the assets that have taken time to build up. So feeling awkward. I'm prepared to do all of that. I wonder whether that's a little subconscious barrier that keeps going. I think availability of land is still a bigger issue. Then there's the time thing, that I'm not doing this full time. Let's say it was the end of my life and I was ready to retire, and perhaps I could have more time to do some of those things. I just like to get out and walk some of the streets because I'm looking for an urban plot. It would be a good idea to really get the map out and say, right, today we're going to this area we know we like, and just wander around. I have done it to a degree, but I would like to do more of that, or hound my local councils for some help, or leaflet an area saying, have you got any land that you want to sell? So all of those sorts of things. I just don't want to miss out on family life. My business obviously takes quite a bit of time too, so there are those things going on. That leads me to choices. What choices do I have in front of me? Well, one of them is just forget about this building a house. Hands up, I failed, I have to move on. Or I could put the idea on the back burner until something changes, until the land comes along, for example, or until I felt I had accumulated enough money that really I could go all out on this. Although I'm not sure money is the issue here. Another alternative is to use the funds that I already have to build an investment property first. And I have to admit, that's quite tempting. Yeah. It is one of my goals long term as well, to build up a portfolio of energy efficient properties, so it would tick that box. Or I could just keep going until I get it done. And that's what I'm going to do. So I apologise now. At the beginning of each episode, I tell you that it's my goal to create this house before I'm 40. I feel I'm that sort of person that this is such a big goal that I can't let it go. I might miss the deadline. And it's a deadline for me. Even if it takes 10 years longer, this has got to be the first thing. There are lots of other building projects that I'd like to do in my lifetime. I hope I'm able to, but I'm not doing any of them until this is out of the way first. So there we go. And if you do see me at all, or if you're chatting online, ask about how the house build's going, because that too will motivate me to do this one way or another, even if it gets nasty. My call to action today is, if you're listening on Stitcher, please give us a thumbs up and write a review. It's a way to pay us back. If you feel you've had any value from any of the podcasts that we've done, that would be awesome. It also helps others find the podcast, and we believe that there's a message that we're trying to get out there about needing more high-performance homes and making sure that anything new, it should be straightforward. It just doesn't seem to be happening like that. Next time, my guest is Christina Schneider. We're going to be looking at her off-grid, earth-sheltered, energy-efficient home that isn't finished quite yet, and you'll find out why when we do that. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.